Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 10th session of the Research Methodology Workshop. Today's session is on how to read an RCT. And our speakers are Dr. Atul Mule and Dr. Saurabh Datta. As they have already been introduced in the past, without wasting any of your time, I request Atul Mule to please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Rajapurkar. Good afternoon, everyone. So, it's a good fortuitous coincidence that we have Teachers' Day today, the birth anniversary of Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, which we celebrate as Teachers' Day. And I take this opportunity to pay my respect and regards to all the teachers. So last time when we spoke, we talked about this concept of knowledge generation, knowledge translation, and knowledge application, and we can just easily turn it around into research, education, and clinical practice. So education is very important as a part and parcel of clinical practice. If you want to become good researcher, definitely you need to be connected to practice as well as education. And even if you just want to be a good clinician, you need to be connected to research as well as education. So it's a good coincidence that we have Teachers' Day today to talk about critical appraisal of an RCT. Now the question is, why do we really need an RCT or critical appraisal? So this is the outline of our today's session. Initially, I'll speak with about a little bit about validity and generalizability. Then we'll see structure of a paper and how do we actually start to read a paper. And then quickly go on to the critical appraisal of the paper that we have at our hand, Bicar ICU, the randomized control trial. And then Dr. Saurabh Datta will be taking over, and he will talk to us about structured approach and checklist approach to make it a little more methodical so that we don't miss anything. And at the end, if we have some time, then I'll speak a few minutes about what exactly is evidence-based medicine. If you don't have time, then we'll skip this part. It's there in the presentation. I am happy to share the presentation and you can see it later on because we would like to have enough time for discussion. So why do we need critical appraisal? Why don't we just believe whatever is printed? I mean, all those journals and all those good researchers, they are printing the findings of their results. And why can't we just believe them? Are they lying to us? I mean, no, they're not lying to us, but there are certain things that we have to analyze and dissect out to really get the meaning of what they are trying to tell us. And there are going to be limitations what they tell us. So first concept that we need to know is validity. What do we understand by validity? So broadly speaking, validity means absence of systematic error, also called as bias. And more valid a study is, the results are more closer to the truth. It is not an absolute yes or no phenomenon, and therefore there is always a gray zone. And nowadays we call it also risk of bias. So validity and risk of bias are more or less similar or synonymous. If we believe in a study, as far as the findings of the study or results of the study are closer to the truth and free from major biases or confounding, then we say that the study is valid or the study findings are trustworthy as far as the patients included in that particular study are concerned. And therefore it is also termed as internal validity as against external validity. So internal validity is simply validity or risk of bias, and it applies to the findings of the study as far as the study subjects and study methods and analysis are concerned. Whereas generalizability is a next step. If we decide that the study is valid, if we decide that the findings of the study are trustworthy, then we ask the next question, okay, this is a good study. The results seem to be reasonably free of biases and they are likely to be true. Then the question is, are we able to apply those results in our patient, in our situation, or in patient who is right in front of me. So for that, you need to examine the PICO statement and overall conduct of the study to decide whether the study subjects are similar to what we have in front of us, and whether the general care which was administered during the trial was also similar to what is being practiced in our part. So to summarize, validity tells us about how accurate the results are as far as the results apply only to the patients included in that particular study, that particular trial. And generalizability is about application of those results in other populations, in other parts of country, in other situations. Now, when we start reading a paper, the paper is usually organized into these sub headings: title and abstract, background, method, results, discussion, conclusion. Now, certain journals unfortunately have started pushing methods at the end, and that is not a very good thing as far at least what I think is that's not a very good practice, because it just breaks the chain of reading. But if you need to then read the methods, then you have to go to the end of the paper, read the methods, and then come back to see the results and discussion. So that's a little bit of a worry, but certain journals have this particular sequence which they follow, and that's the commonest one. When we start to read the study, we need to know if we have some subject knowledge. For example, if you want to read about, let us say, IgA nephropathy, and use of immunosuppression IgA nephropathy. Now I need to know a little bit about IgA nephropathy, what its natural history is, how is it diagnosed, and what kind of clinical problems that it may present. If I don't know enough about it, then I'll try to read it first and try to get my knowledge refreshed. So, for example, someone from other specialties, for like orthopedic or some surgical trials, they want my opinion about it. Then I need to know what they are trying to do, what the disease they are talking about, and then only I can actually help them, or I can understand a little bit more about what exactly is done in the study. The second part is the methods knowledge, that is the type of the study. So type of the study can be RCT, can be observational study, meta-analysis, time series, whatever. So depending on the type of study that we are reading, we need to have some knowledge about the methods applied, the strengths of those methods, limitations of those methods, and how to interpret them. The general evaluation includes these steps. We need to ask ourselves a few questions while reading a paper, rather than just read it as a novel or as a fiction. If we have certain points in our mind while reading, then it will be easier to summarize at the end, as Dr. Datta will demonstrate us later. So we need to first try to understand what is the main question the paper is trying to address, what are the main conclusions, what exactly is the evidence and data provided in the same paper which is justifying those conclusions. Often we see, in fact, it's very common in thesis that conclusions, there are like 4, 5, 6 different conclusions written in the thesis, and now or a very only 1 or 2 are actually justified by data presented in the same study or same thesis. So it should never happen. The conclusions of the study must be supported by data from the same study. Then we look at quality of evidence and importance of the conclusions in the context of in our clinical practice or patients in front of us. Then there are these 2 papers. I would strongly recommend you to read those. This is about how to read a clinical trial if it is positive, and there are some set of questions that I have identified, and we should go through them. And if the trial is negative, then there are another set of questions we should try to identify and answer those questions. And again, these 2 papers are worth reading. So let us now come to the randomized clinical trial and critical appraisal, how to read a randomized clinical trial. So I would like you to look at this diagram very carefully. We have learned about RCTs in the previous sessions. But this is the diagram that I would like to be etched in your mind all the time. So it will be helpful in any design of a study as well as a critical appraisal of an RCT. So whenever we are designing a study on an RCT, we have a target population in mind. Then we have a study population based on eligibility criteria. Obviously, all people who are screened are not included in the trial, so there will be some exclusions right here. Then there will be participants who will be randomized into intervention arm and control arm. And then obviously there is something called as allocation concealment that we have learned earlier. All the people who are included in the trial, unfortunately, don't end up for the complete follow-up. There will be some withdrawals, and we need to pay attention to those withdrawals. And then we have to look at what outcomes are measured, how they are measured, and how they are analyzed. Now, this is something about the conduct of trial, what we call as 4 C's: compliance, crossover, co-intervention, and contamination. Now, these are the things which are involved in the conduct of trial, which may introduce bias, as we will see later. And of course, we need to know whether the trial is blinded or unblinded, because we know that unblinded trials always have a possibility of certain amount of biases, especially the information bias, which can creep in. So this is our trial. I hope everybody has read it. And actually it's a 2-year-old trial. So most of us might have read it like 2 years back, and some of us have revised it last week when we decided to share this trial with everyone. So when we start to read a trial, we look at the title first. And if the title is interesting, then we look at abstract. I mean, honestly speaking, there are so many journals, so many articles coming out every month. I think it is practically impossible to go through each and every study in detail. So the purpose of title and abstract is firstly to decide whether that trial or the study is really of interest to us and whether we really want to get into details of that. The other purpose is also that we need to know what is being published on what subject and what kind of results they showed, because you may not have time to go through it, go through the trial in detail immediately. But suppose few months later, if you have a patient in front of us, which reminds you of patients included in a particular trial, then at that time you should be able to pull out that trial and go through it in more detail and appraise it more critically. So abstracts again are usually structured. They will tell us that it's a multi-center trial, open label phase 3. So it's a single country but multi-center trial. It will tell us what kind of, so basically it's a PICO statement. So it's patients, what kind of patients were included. So all ICU patients, severe acidosis, what was the intervention, which was soda backup, what was the control arm, which was no treatment, and the outcome. So they have told us about the PICO right up front, and also told us that they had analyzed by intention to treat, which is good. Then the abstract tells us the number of patients included. So 194 patients in the control versus 195 patients in the backup group. So around 200 patients in each group. And primary outcome, which was a composite outcome, 71% versus 66%. And confidence interval is crossing 0. Here the null value is 0. No absolute difference is 0 difference. And therefore it is not significant. So P is greater than 0.05. They have also told us in abstract the components of that composite endpoint, which is a 28-day mortality. Again, the p-value here was not significant, but starting to get really interesting, p 0.09. And also the next thing is a priori defined subgroup of AKI 203. Again, they tell us that the mortality was significantly lower in the bicarb arm with a p of 0.028. So that may be a little bit more interesting to many of us, because we so much put emphasis on p-value, which may or may not be right. But at least there is some hint of some benefit somewhere. So it sort of makes us or prompts us to go a little bit more into the study and examine it a little bit more in more detail. And lastly, the abstract also tells us about the side effects. Now, if we don't have enough information, as I said, about the topic at hand or the disease or intervention, then we need to read the introduction part first. Introduction is usually arranged in three components. The first component is usually the disease. The second component is the intervention, and the third component is the aim of the trial or aim of the study. So if you have enough information about the disease and intervention, then you may just jump to methods straight away. The first thing that we now want to try to find in the methods is again clearly define the patient's intervention, control, and outcomes. That is our first job. So let us read this. So what have they said? We included adult patients who were admitted within 48 hours to an ICU with severe acidemia, which is well defined, and sodium bicarbonate level of less than 20. And so this and is important again here. Okay. And so it is not just acidemia, but acidemia associated with additional finding, which is either a SOFA score of 4 or lactate levels of more than 2. So that defines their inclusion criteria. And they also excluded a bunch of patients, and most of them are looking sensible. We need to also make sure who is included and who is excluded, because later on when we decide whether this trial is applicable to our patients, we need to know who is actually not part of the trial. For example, ketoacidosis here. So result of the study do not apply to ketoacidosis because patients of ketoacidosis were not part of the trial. So in general, the exclusions sound quite sensible. Obviously, you would exclude respiratory acidosis. You would exclude people who have got massive bicarbonate loss because they would need replacement of bicarbonate, and randomizing them to no treatment would be quite unethical. And so exclusions don't sound too arbitrary at all. So that is a summary of your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Then we come to randomization and masking. So it was a 1:1 randomization. That means equal number of patients in both arms, which is usually good because this is the most powerful design. Then this patient was stratified into 3 strata, which was sepsis, AKI 2 or 3, and age more than 65. So why do we need this? And this is somewhat related to the next point, which is that they tell us that randomization was done by minimization technique. So what is this minimization technique? So understand this, we need to just get in, refresh our understanding about why randomization is done. So in a simple randomization, we would expect that all prognostic risk factors or confounders, whether known or unknown, will be distributed equally or balanced out equally in both groups, whether treatment group or control group. That is the theory of randomization. And it works well if we have a relatively large trial. And by large trial, we usually mean, let us say, more than 1,000 patients or so in each group. So if you've got more than 1,000 patients in each group, usually or almost invariably, all the major risk factors or major confounders, whether you know them or don't know them, will be balanced out equally in each arm. The problem comes when the sample size is not that high. When you have only 100, 200, 300 patients to randomize, and you've got 5, 6, 7 known risk factors which will influence your outcome, then you start to get worried whether you by chance have an imbalance between the two arms. So for example, what if you have 60% of patients in bicarb arm having sepsis and only 20% of control arm having sepsis? That will be a major imbalance, and we know that sepsis is a major determinant of mortality. So how do we balance out and make sure that two arms are balanced out in terms of sepsis? So one way is to do stratification. The second thing is called as minimization. So what is minimization? Minimization is a type of adaptive randomization. Now, typical randomization, so for example, if we don't do minimization and just use stratified randomization, what happens is that we have got two groups, and we are going to randomize based on presence or absence of sepsis. That's one stratum we are considering. So whenever a patient comes and qualifies for recruitment and is enrolled in the trial, whether he'll go into the bicarbonate group or treatment group will depend on whether he has sepsis or not. And if there is no minimization technique, every patient entered in the trial, whether he has sepsis or don't have sepsis, will have equal probability of being allocated to treatment arm or control arm. And since we have got two groups here, the probability will be 0.5 or 50%. So every new patient who is entered in trial, whether he has sepsis or no sepsis, has a 50% chance of getting allocated to the respective stratum. Now this is true whether this is the first patient included in the trial, 50th patient included in the trial, or whether you are enrolling 1,000 patients. Now the problem with that is that you may still end up with some imbalance. So what adaptive randomization tries to do, the theory, at least the theory what it tells us to do is that it tries to minimize this imbalance between the two arms. There are two major types of adaptive randomization. One is called as baseline covariate adaptive randomization. So minimization is a type of baseline covariate adaptive randomization. That means that, or to put it very simply, if if you find after 50 or 60 or 100 patients enrolled in the trial, there are too many patients of sepsis enrolled in one arm than the other, then the subsequent patients who are being enrolled in the trial, the probability will be adjusted such that this balance will get corrected. Now that can be done after every patient or every few patients, and there are techniques to do that. There are proponents of minimization technique. There are people who have got reservations about minimization technique. But suffice it to say that the purpose of that is to reduce the imbalance between the two arms with respect to known prognostic factor or with respect to known confounders which are important in terms of outcome. Whenever there is a randomization sequence, the next thing we need to ask is how was the randomization administered, because that is how we will know whether the randomization or the allocation was considered adequately or not. It was a web-based method, so we can assume that the allocation consideration was reasonably good and there was no masking. So this is a big limitation, if you want to say that. So it was an unblinded study, and unblinded studies can have some problems. So we will keep this in mind when we are looking at the conduct of the study and the results. Next, again details about intervention and control. Now this is a homework. They have used 4.2% soda backup, and you should find out what kind of soda backup is available with us and how can you make it 4.2%. They have told us about volume. They have also told us that there was no sham or placebo given in the control. So control group basically did not receive any placebo or any matching volume of any fluid. All right, so coming back to our scheme of things, and so we have seen the eligibility criteria, we looked at who were included, we have seen how the randomization was done, allocation concealment I think was reasonably good. We know what exactly was the intervention, and we know that the controls were actually not treated and there was no blinding involved. So now let's move forward to outcomes. So the outcome was a primary composite of 28-day mortality and presence of any organ failure at day 7, and there were multiple secondary outcomes. Now whenever there is a primary composite outcome, there is always some questions involved. Why are they used so commonly, and are they always appropriate, or there can be some problems associated with that? So one of the major reasons why they are used commonly is simply because when you use composite outcomes, you are increasing the event rate or outcome rate, or a number of outcomes, to put it more simply. And if you have more outcomes, you will need a smaller sample to enroll the trial. So one of the major driving force of using composite outcomes is to reduce the sample size required. But is it appropriate? Is that the only reason, or are there any other valid reasons or correct reasons when it can be used? So to give an example, suppose we have a trial of IgA nephropathy and some immunosuppression, and we are looking at ESRD and or the proportion of patients who reach dialysis at the end of your 5 year study period. Suppose what happens if a lot of people just die, and it is, we know that IgA nephropathy is slowly progressive and not everybody will end up with ESRD. People will have other events, and if there are other patient oriented or important events as far as the patient are concerned which have equal weightage, then they can be included as a composite outcome. So here death and ESRD could be a composite outcome because you may actually reduce some ESRD proportion, but what if more people are dying with with your intervention? Obviously, it's not a good intervention then. So it's also competing outcome. So if you have competing outcome or equal weightage, multiple outcomes from the point of view of patient, then they can be appropriately included as composite outcomes. Otherwise, like actually in this trial, I will see this later, the 7-day organ failure is not a very, it doesn't have the same weight as mortality. It's a relatively soft outcome as far as the patient is concerned. Patient doesn't want to know whether he has one organ failure at the end of 7 days or not. He wants to know really major things like did he need dialysis or not, did he live or not, did he need ventilator or not. So those kinds of patient-centric outcomes are far more important. 7-day organ failure is not, definitely not a outcome which has the same weightage as 28-day mortality. So it is probably, it was probably done to increase sample size in this trial at least. And it can be problematic sometimes because if you have got two different or three or four different components of the outcome, and certain components show benefit and certain components show uh, worse outcomes, then it will be very difficult to analyze and interpret those trials. And there are examples of that kind of trials in literature. So we have to be very careful when we interpret composite outcomes at the end of the trial. Now analysis, we need to start reading analysis. I think most of us just skip this part and just go to result side. But I think we have had enough knowledge of statistics by now, so we should start reading we should start reading analysis now. So what it tells us is that they had an interim analysis, and they also tell us this part which is very important, which is um, how did they come to this sample size, because we'll come back to this again. So their assumption was the primary composite endpoint would be 45% in the control arm and 35% in the bicarbonate arm. Based on that, they calculated their sample size. So we'll see how accurate that assumption was. Now, a little bit about interim analysis. I won't go too much in detail, but the concept of interim analysis, why we need to have stringent p-values, stringent alpha error for interim analysis, it is because it is somewhat related to multiple comparisons. If you have multiple comparisons, as you know, P 0.05 only means that 5% chance of alpha error, or that means 5% chance of false positive conclusion. That means 1 in 20 times the uh, if you find a positive result, it will be just by chance and merely uh, it is not a true effect actually. So to guard against that, you need to have a more stringent p-value at the initial part of the trial. And as you know, if you see that the true effect is uh, so the true effect, should look at a trial where the hazard ratio is, we are looking at hazard ratio as outcome, and hazard ratio of 1 is a null effect. And this is our minimal clinically important difference that we are trying to detect based on our sample size. So as the trial progresses, you will see that if you keep, so if you got 500 patients, if you keep analyzing results after every 50 patients, then you will get some hazard ratio, and that hazard ratio will keep on changing around the final hazard ratio. It is not a uniform actually. It won't change this uniformly as depicted in this picture, but it can have a little change, can go up and down every time. And in the initial part, when the sample size is small, the confidence intervals will be very wide. So you need to have enough confidence in your estimates to make sure that the treatment is really effective. If you want to stop the trial early. So in the initial part, you need to have um, very very strong p-value uh, to to decide that the trial is to decide that the treatment is effective. And as the trial progresses, as you get more and more patients and more information, you can let your p-value come close to 0.05. So this is also something called as alpha spending function, and these are the three commonly used interim analysis methods. Now, in this particular trial, they have not told us what method they have used. What they have only told us is that they did interim analysis in the middle, that is when 50% patients were enrolled, and at that time they looked at an alpha of 0.02, and at the end of the trial, alpha of 0.03 was considered significant. So this is what they have chosen as their alpha spending function. And in the initial part it was not as strict, but at the end actually it seems to be pretty strict. So interim analysis is also something which can be discussed in the advanced sessions on clinical trials next month. So I think I won't go too much in detail with that now. Then we have intention to treat analysis, and we are going to look at intention to treat analysis. Per protocol analysis we are not going to talk about now. Lastly, they are telling us about how they have done the analysis, and unadjusted chi-square was used for the primary analysis. Now here again, typically most experts and statisticians will tell us that if you are using stratification in design, then you must use stratification in analysis. If you use stratification in analysis, that means if you do a stratified analysis, you are going to have more power of the analysis, and therefore you are going to have lower p-values. So if you ignore stratification in analysis and just do unadjusted analysis at the end, your p-values are likely to be more conservative. That means they are likely to be higher than expected, which is also okay. I mean, if despite that, if you have got a significant p-value, then you're pretty sure that the stratified or adjusted analysis will show even lower p-values. And lastly, I'll just focus here, multiple comparisons. They have taken some note of multiple comparisons and use Bonferroni method to correct for that. So that sounds good. So this is just a summary of analysis. So let's move to the results. When we go to the results, the first thing we have to look at the trial flow. And what we look at trial flow are two things. Number one is who were excluded. As we said, there will be some people who would not even be included in the trial, and you need to see who was excluded, why were they not included. Suppose there is a trial in which there are something like 5,000 patients screened and only 1,000 patients or 500 patients included, then it tells us something about the trial, that we see a huge number of patients but only few are included in the trial. That means the trial is super selective, and the findings of the result may not be applicable to a lot of people, a lot of our patients that we see every day. The next thing that we see is who were excluded after randomization, and that is very crucial to decide the bias or validity as far as this particular trial is concerned. Luckily, this is an ICU trial, and in ICU, most of us, them are captive patients. So you don't worry about follow-ups. Almost everybody will be followed up till the end. There are not too many exclusions. Then next thing to look at is baseline characteristics. The typical table 1 in any trial. There are two things that you look at in table 1. Number 1 is all major known risk factors are included or not, especially at strata. And secondly, you need to you try to see whether the patients, what kind of patients are included, and are the patients that we see are similar to those included in the trial. Because as I just said, if the patients included in the trial are super selective, then we have a problem of generalizability. So we need to know who are included in the trial. So just highlighting a few things which are interesting 60% patients were septic. Almost half of them had akin 2 and 3, and septic shock was present in almost half of the patients. These are pretty sick patients, and almost 80% were also on ventilator. Uh, the next is about a lot of physiological parameters that we'll skip at the moment. Then the next, after this, we need to find out how the trial was conducted. So remember, we talked about 4 C's: compliance, crossover, contamination, and those are the things we have to see, find out in this. So obviously compliance is no problem. ICU trial, everybody does what is prescribed. Actually, this compliance is more about the compliance of the investigators or doctors who are actually giving the treatment, because patient really has no choice here. So compliance was fairly good. Now they tell us 24% of control group received bicarbonate within 7 hours. So that's a little bit of a problem. This is what we will call as contamination. That means control group, we would like to have absolutely no exposure to the intervention of hand. If a lot of patients in control group also receive the intervention, then what it does, it dilutes the difference between the two arms. It will bias the result towards null. That means it will bias the result toward no effect or not a significant difference. Another thing to look at is how well the two groups were separated. The intermediate aim was to achieve a normal pH or a reasonably normal pH, and that was achieved in only 60% of patients in the bicarb group as against 26% in the control arm. So again, the separation in the two arms was not great, so or it was not as good as you would have liked, and therefore this is again something that might lead to your a more conservative results. That means they will bias the results towards null. Then you are going to look at the co-interventions. What other things that they were administering? Did they tell us about that? Unfortunately, they don't tell us much about all the other co-interventions, including steroids, because half of the patient had septic shock, and a lot of people must be using steroids for septic shock. And co-interventions are especially important because this was an unblinded trial. If there was blinding, and even if they don't tell us about any co-interventions, we can be reasonably assured that since nobody knows who is in the treatment arm and who is in control arm, everybody will be treated equally. But if you know who is getting the intervention and who is getting the control group or placebo, then there is always a chance that people will be treated differently, or the patients will be treated differently, and certain differences will crop up which will bias the result in either direction. It is not necessary towards the null. And again, follow-up was complete, so there was no withdrawal, so that was a good part. So our scheme again, so we have seen most of these things. Okay, so there are no withdrawals, there was some contamination, the separation was not as good as we would have liked. And because there was blinding, there is always a problem regarding co-intervention. We cannot assume that co-interventions were done equally. So jumping to the primary outcome. So I have made a table exactly same as what was given in their outcomes table. And so as you can see, primary composite outcome, there was no significant difference. So P is not significant. They have chosen to give us absolute risk reduction, okay, which is good in a sense, because if you have got a 5.5% reduction, you can easily convert it into number needed to treat, because 100 divided by this value is your number needed to treat. But this is not significant. You can see the confidence interval is pretty wide. Then they also told us the components, and both the components are going in the same direction and both are not significant. This is a little interesting, but still not significant. As far as the organ failure is concerned, now this is a typo. This typo is actually in the paper, because this should be somewhere around -7. But despite that, both components are not significant. Now, to just tell you or refresh your mind, this is what we call an effect size. Okay, so the difference between the two arms is effect size, and the confidence interval around 2 is what is called as precision. So this is what you will need to remember at the end when we analyze the table, analyze the paper in a structured fashion. They also given us the crude OR and hazard ratios, and they are in the same line. Now, post fact, you can always calculate the power of the study. So remember that they have told us that they were expecting 45% here and 30% here. And what we have is starkly different numbers. So we can put those numbers in any of the software and ask, okay, this is the numbers and these are the event rates that we have got. So what is the power actually? So power actually achieved for the composite outcome was only 18%. That means the false negative rate could have been 82%. And similarly, you can look at mortality, slightly better power, but very high type 2 error. So the studies obviously was very underpowered for the event rates that were seen in the trial. So if you want to actually look at just mortality, if you suppose want to design another trial based on information got from this trial, you know that the mortality here was 54% versus 45%. And now if you want to know whether or how much sample you need to decide whether this is going to be statistical signal or whether this is consistent enough. So you want to design a new trial, what kind of sample you need? So you'll need almost double the sample, more than 850 patients, just for the mortality as a single endpoint, primary endpoint of 28-day mortality. If you want to design a new trial, now you will need more than 800 patients. But I'm going to go one step beyond and ask a really, really important question. Ultimately, we are not interested only in just 0.05. Okay, we don't want to see only p of less than 0.05. For a minute, you can imagine that this trial, this very trial, had 1,000 patients in each arm, and they showed exactly same results. Okay, so mortality, 28-day mortality in the treatment in the control arm is 54%, and the treatment arm is 45%. It will come out as significant if you have suppose 1,000 patients in each arm. But the reduction in the mortality is 9%. So the question as a clinician that we want to ask is this 9% reduction in mortality is good enough? Is it acceptable? Is it something that you want to see in your patients given the cost of the treatment, given the convenience of the treatment, and given the adverse events of the treatment? Luckily here the bicarbonate cost and convenience is not an issue. Adverse event also not much as has been shown in this trial. So this is a real question that we want to ask. It's not just the p-value, but the effect size that you are seeing, is that effect size large enough that will make you change your practice and start implementing that result in your practice. Now let's look at the subgroup. Because it's an a priori defined subgroup, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and also it is significant. So yeah, you are trying to tell us that 28-day mortality in patients who have got AKI 2 or 3 was significantly reduced by PICA, and that's very nice looking graph and very appealing to us. So that's good. So let us focus on this next diagram. This is the same analysis that telling us. Let us focus on AKI subgroup first. So you can see if you don't have AKI, or that is AKI 01, you have almost no reduction in mortality. Okay, almost no reduction in mortality, very wide confidence interval. Whereas if you have AKI that is akin to 3, you have got a big reduction in mortality, that is 17.7% less mortality compared to compare group by PICA, and that P is pretty significant. Now this is what is the adjusted P. Remember, they have used Bonferroni's adjustment. Now there are only 2 groups, so Bonferroni means just double the p-value. So that's what it is, right? So at least from that part, it looks good. It's a very strong effect in the akin 2-3 category, and even after adjusting for multiple comparison, it still remains statistically significant. Effect size is large, so 18%, 17-18% reduction is pretty huge. So if you turn it around into number needed to treat, it will be like just 6 patients. So you just treat 6 patients with bicarb of severe acidemia who have AKI 2 or 3, and you will save one patient if you treat every 6 patients. Now, that's a very strong effect size, but the confidence interval is relatively wide. So the effect the absolute risk reduction can be only 2% and not necessarily 17%. So it's a relatively wide confidence interval. Now, the next thing I want to focus is on this p-value of heterogeneity. They told us that they have tested for interaction, but they have not told us what test of interaction they have done. Now, generally speaking, tests of interaction, interaction, heterogeneity, effect modification, sometimes they are all used interchangeably in different contexts. But let us take that the test of heterogeneity is same as the interaction that they have tested. And they tell us that the test was strongly positive. That means the P was very significant. It tells us that the two groups are definitely not coming from the same population. The two samples are drawn from a different population and they are heterogeneous. So this gives a more credibility to the subgroup analysis. But I have a little problem about this, because if you now look at the next one, you look at this group, which is age group. Okay, age less than 65, age more than 65. Now you look at the effect sizes in the two groups, and there is hardly any difference between the two. Okay, reduction of 8.7%, reduction of 10.1%, hardly any difference. But still the test of heterogeneity is very strongly positive. And then again look at the next group here. Again, visually and actually in numbers, there is not much difference between the two groups. And now here the test of heterogeneity is not significant. So I am a little bit doubtful about what exactly they have done. I seriously doubt this. I seriously think that there's an error somewhere here. So I just did one quick calculation of heterogeneity test, and for the AKI categories, if you look at the risk ratios or relative risk, the p-value is 0.15. And if you look at risk difference, the p-value turns out to be 0.10. As it is, the tests of heterogeneity or interaction are not very sensitive. So they often fail to detect clinically important heterogeneity or effect modification. And therefore, here, a lot of people feel that for a test of interaction or heterogeneity, p-value of 0.1 or 0.15 may indicate important heterogeneity. So as far as the AKI categories are concerned, yes, there is definitely some heterogeneity in the two strata, and the same test when done for the other two subgroups do not turn, they come up with a p-value of 0.8 or so. They are definitely not heterogeneous. So whenever we are looking at a subgroup analysis, we have to be very careful, because we cannot be drawing too much of emphasis in subgroup analysis. There are multiple instances where a subgroup analysis was shown to have a benefit in a particular subgroup, and in subsequent trials have actually been negative. So at least what authorities say, these are the 3 or 4 things that we need to look at while evaluating subgroup analysis. If you want to have some credibility of subgroup analysis, then the subgroups have to be specified a priority. There must be adjusted for multiple comparisons. There must be a test of interaction done and shown that the interaction existed. And lastly and importantly, there has to be some biological plausibility or some explanation around that. So as far as the AKI subgroup is concerned, I think based on the data they have provided, they do look heterogeneous. There is an interaction. They have adjusted for multiple comparison, and still the p-value is significant. This was stated a priori, so you have to give credit for that. And there is some biological plausibility as well. You would think that people with severe kidney injury will not be able to correct their acidosis on their own, and therefore they will more likely to benefit by bicarbonate therapy compared to those with mild AKI who will still have some kidney function intact, and they might be able to correct their acidosis on their own without having to give an exogenous soda bicarbonate. So this is the biological plausibility argument. So yes, subgroup analysis does look a little bit creditable, at least in this trial. Lastly, we need to look at is what is the event rate in the control group. Sometimes what happens is that your intervention looks too good simply because your control arm has done very badly. So if your control arm mortality is much worse than expected, then you will find a significant benefit of intervention. Although the intervention arm mortality is not very different than what you see in your clinical practice. So this is something to guard against. There's a bunch of secondary outcomes. I'm not going to go into that, but secondary outcomes are primarily aimed at 2 or 3 things. Number one is we have to look at whether they're consistent with the primary outcomes. Secondly, there is also a lot of physiological outcomes that you would like to see, and at least try and find some benefit, at least in the process of care, even if the ultimate patient outcomes may not be different. So secondary outcomes are somewhat useful from that point of view. And as an example, in this particular trial, need for renal replacement treatment and duration of treatment, duration of dialysis, as well as dialysis dependency was less in the bicarbonate arm. That was again statistically significant. And although again I'll emphasize this is secondary analysis, so we shouldn't have too much emphasis on this, but at least there is some positivity seen in the secondary analysis if people want to use bicarbonate in these kind of patients. And last point that we must pay attention to is adverse events. So they have told us about the adverse event: metabolic alkalosis, hypernatremia, and hypocalcemia were more frequent with bicarbonate group. It is entirely explainable by the mechanism of bicarbonate, so it's not surprising at all. So these can be anticipated, prevented, treated reasonably easily, and as they said in their trial, none were life-threatening. But these adverse events we have to look at in every trial to ultimately balance out risk versus benefits, because whatever benefits that you may judge the intervention is giving us need to be balanced out with the costs, risks, convenience, and patient values and preferences. So I think what I have done till now is just go to the paper and with trying to answer a few questions. But after you go through the paper and even if you are trying to have some points in your mind, at the end we sometimes tend to get lost and we forget a lot of things. So it is a good idea to summarize the important points which will help us to really put this results in context, and therefore we need to have a structured approach, and there are different structured approaches. So Dr. Saurabh Datta will tell us about the checklist approach, and I'll now request Dr. Saurabh Datta to tell us how we can approach this in a more methodical and structured manner. Dr. Saurabh Datta, please.
No, 1 minute, Atul. Would you be taking a couple of questions or do you take all questions at the end?
I think we'll take questions at the end, sir.
Okay. Okay.